Hey everyone, in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, David has just found out that his son has died in battle. As Absalom was pursuing David, David then began pursuing Absalom after years and years and years of fighting back and forth. Maybe not face to face, but certainly a war nonetheless between father and son. It all culminates to a moment where Absalom loses his life in this battle in 2 Samuel 18. And verse 33 of that chapter says that then the king, speaking of David, was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He repeats it multiple times, mourning the loss of his son, Absalom. And if you're unfamiliar with the story, they've had a really sordid history, a very sordid past that begins all the way in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and goes all the way to 18. This entire life encapsulated into these few chapters. And it was not always good, and the way it ended was certainly not good either. And if you're unfamiliar with the story, you might seem to think that then David is just mourning the loss of his son, period. But I think there's something deeper there when we take a look at his life. David is also mourning what could have been. You know, when someone loses their life too early or too soon, we say, or they have some massive injury and they were destined to be a famous star, you're mourning the loss of what could have been. And man, Absalom was supposed to be next. Throughout 1 and 2 Samuel, it's about kings, even though it's called 1 and 2 Samuel, not 1 and 2 Kings, but that's for another story. 1 and 2 Samuel beginning, with Saul becoming king, and then David becoming king, and that transition to David becoming king, and then who will succeed David when he's gone? It could have been Absalom. But when we trace their story, David is now feeling, I believe, in this verse 33 of chapter 18, remorse, mourning, pain, not just at the loss, but also at what David was incapable of doing, what David did not do, what David failed to do as a father, as a king, as a man, as a husband, as a person, as a child of God. All the things that we could have done, should have done, wanted to do, the things that could have interrupted or stopped this mess, whatever it is, from happening. And my first reaction to this is, well, what could have David done? David says that, "Oh, if only I had died in your place," speaking to Absalom. But what, is it more than just dying for him? Could David have done anything else in Absalom's life to prevent him getting to this point? And that's really what I want to share for just a few moments, is starting from the beginning of this story that we're introduced to in 2 Samuel 13, is David didn't address any emotions, any issues happening in his family, specifically between him and Absalom. Specifically just that relationship. David was absent. David ignored significant moments in Absalom's life and didn't get involved whatsoever, at all. David's other son Amnon committed atrocities and crimes against Tamar, his other daughter. Absalom had a huge response to this, so much so that he plotted and then murdered Amnon for what he had done. All it tells us in the scriptures is that it made David angry. That's all, is that David was angry at this in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21. He was angry, and what did he do with his anger? Nothing. According to the scriptures, he doesn't do anything in response. He doesn't reach out to Tamar to comfort her. He doesn't reach out to Absalom to talk about what has happened, or even to confront the fact that he murdered his brother. Although Absalom thought it was justified, David didn't confront him at all. Why did you do this? How could you have done this? Why did you feel justified? Punishing him, doing anything to confront what Absalom had done. And he just ignores this. He doesn't address Absalom's emotions or his thoughts or his feelings or any of the issues that might have even led him to do that. Which, as a father and as a king, those are two responsibilities that he has seemingly just missed and failed. And he didn't confront at all. It just says that when he found out what Absalom had done in murdering Amnon, he just tore his clothes and got angry. Again, he just got angry. So when something happens in your world that makes you really angry, you want to tear stuff, you want to punch a wall, something that really, really, really drives you to anger, what are you doing with that anger? Are you using it for your benefit? Are you causing just to lash out? Or are you just another person walking around angry? David didn't allow this to be used for any positive good, not for any type of intervention or positive thing for his life or for Absalom. Because we're not meant to walk around just carrying our anger, just harboring it in our life. What about you? What are you doing with the anger in your life? The things that you really get driven up a wall about. Are you able to use that for any kind of good? Are you able to use that to push you to do anything about things that are in front of your life, to intervene, to get involved, any of those things? Because Absalom has no consequences. Absalom goes into exile, and there's nothing to indicate that was because of David. He went into exile because of his murder, and he spent years out. He spent years away. It took him 2 years to plan to kill Amnon. He did that. It's 2 years since he saw King David. Another 3 years in exile. That's 5 years since he's seen his father. 5 years since he's been around him. And he's now in exile. And after years, he gets brought back in, one way or another, through the story, and you can take a look at that. But he gets brought back into the kingdom after exile, and there's no reconciliation. David welcomes him back in to live in the city, live in Israel, in Jerusalem, but no relationship, no reconciliation. He says, oh yeah, you can come back into my house, but really, it's actually like, I'll let you live on the block of where I live, in some place that I own, but we won't have contact, we won't text or call, we won't look at each other, I will ignore that you exist, but you're brought back in. Which is a really, really lazy excuse for reconciliation. Because no face-to-face contact is needed for that. No communication is needed for that. No relationship is required just to give someone space to be in your area. So David didn't do anything in terms of work of that uncomfortable nature of what it is to confront someone, to reconcile, to forgive, to come face to face with someone. He avoided that for whatever reason, whether it be anger, whether it be the uncomfortability of it, pushed him away from it. It prevented him from having any relationship with his son at that point. Yet he was right by just allowing him back in. We as people really need to push back against the tendency to avoid confrontation when it might be needed. We shouldn't be confrontational people, but we also should not avoid confrontation that might be required or needed. Because what are some of the consequences of not confronting things that need to be confronted? Absalom had done wrong. There's a lot of years that have passed between this relationship. David needs to have that confrontation with Absalom. Hey, what happened? Where do we move from here? Does David need to forgive him or not? Has Absalom been punished fully or has he not? What can they even talk about in this relationship? And David just ignores it. Which, if you're Absalom, how would that make you feel? This elephant in the room of, my father won't even speak to me in any way about what happened. And so we just avoid it and expect that things are going to get better. How often in your life have you avoided something that needs to be addressed and it's just gotten better? And maybe if it has, it was something small, but on something on this level of scale, in family ties, in businesses, in churches, how often has it just gone away? Especially when a pattern begins to form. Absalom's anger pushed him to murder Amnon. Then he goes into the wilderness in exile. And when he comes back, guess what? He's continuing to be ignored by his father and the king, not even able to see him face to face, the Bible tells us in chapter 14. And so what does Absalom do? He sets a fire in the city to get David's attention. That finally gets his attention. Because that's what it is. Is that what's required to get you to even see me face to face, to have a conversation? And so he acts out as a child would do, an immature child with a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of angst at the lack of communication about where do I stand with you because you're unwilling to even go there with me. And so Absalom sets a fire, it gets David's attention, it forces his hand to speak to him. David is a passive father, a passive king, a passive man. And I feel like many issues persist and grow within our society and our churches because of passivity, because of people not willing to do the things that are required to be done or addressed, because we're unwilling to have certain conversations, or because something that will be uncomfortable prevents us from actually even doing it instead of just doing it uncomfortable. And so his hand is forced. He has to allow him to see him face to face. And so he brings him in, he kisses him ceremonially, which we don't even know if that was a full forgiveness, and there was no conversation really. He just said, oh, okay, well, here's a blessing. But was it full forgiveness? Because he wasn't restored to his position. Absalom wasn't brought back as the crown prince, the heir to the throne. And so it gets worse and worse. It continues on and on as the chapters continue. They don't have this relationship, this confrontation. Absalom then says, okay, well, I guess I need to be king then. He leads this political revolt and coup over years and years. Again, another 4 years to then plot out a plan to overthrow his father to take the throne. Never addressed, never forgiven, never communicated with. When we started with David at the end of Absalom's life pleading, oh, my son, my son, my son, my son, if only I had died in your place. That speaks of love. That speaks of care. That speaks of emotion and desire for his son. But where is that throughout the story? You can say all you want when something's gone out of pain of loss. But where were you? Where were you showing up throughout the life of Absalom? In confrontation, in all the quietness, in the years that have passed when you had the opportunity to do so, and you didn't show up. And it gets worse and worse until Absalom stages a coup and David is on the run, and Absalom proves himself as a man over his father, David, the king. And it just gets worse and worse until we arrive at the point where Absalom loses his life as David is in pursuit of him because he needs the throne. He is the king. And so there is so much more that David could have done in that relationship. And so I think in many relationships, in many areas of our life, in business, in churches, in work, in our families, in anything in our life, these relationships that are all tied throughout all of those, what can we do to address things, to prevent things from happening in the future? What would have happened if David got involved with Absalom, if he had confronted him, if he had spoken to him, if he had helped him process his anger, or maybe David's anger as well? How could they have worked through that for some type of positive gain? What about in your life? But also don't let it get to a point, because there's only so much that you can do for people. There's only so much that you can do to get involved in someone's life, and their outcomes of their lives are not necessarily placed on you. They're not your fault for whatever happens or may not happen in their life. And so what can you do to get involved? What can you do to help them? Probably quite a bit, but you can't save them. You can't change the entire trajectory of their life just on your own merit or just what you do. And David, he wishes that he could have died for Absalom, that he could have died in his place. But maybe not everyone is worth you losing everything in your life for. Family, people that you care for. The Bible says that greater love hath no man than to lay down one's life for another, for a brother. That is love. That is significant. But don't be taking the blame of the way someone else's life goes because of yourself. And so there is this tug of war of where do those interconnect, both of those things of, I wish I could do more and I can do more. And how do you weigh those in what the outcomes are? But the reality is David needed to show up. He was expected to show up and he didn't. And there are people that you need to show up for in your life. And showing up for is one thing. Losing everything for them, that's another. And the reality is, David wished he could have died for Absalom, but he couldn't. And he didn't. And he can't. There are people you can't die for. You can't sacrifice everything for. You are just a person. You, like David and I, are just flawed people on the same journey of life, trying to get closer to God, to be better, to do better, to live more fully in what he would have for us. So David fell short as a king. He fell short as a man, fell short as a husband, etc. Fill in the blanks of what is in your life. And so you might identify with that. Don't we all fall short in those ways, in wanting to be better and fill up and own up to those roles and live up to them like David? But David was crying out that he wishes he could have died for Absalom. There's a lot he could have done, but he couldn't have died for him because we can't do that. But you know who can die for him and who has died for them? Jesus. Jesus weeps in the same way as a rejected king like David was as they were choosing Absalom in this coup. Jesus was a rejected king in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the same place that David had wept and prayed earlier on in 2 Samuel. Jesus also wept because he was not chosen as king. He was rejected as king. And Jesus doesn't just say, oh, if I could have died for them. Oh, what I could have done. Oh, if I could have or should have or would have or could have. He really does. He really does go and die for you and I, for people who have rejected him. People who have said, we don't want you as our king. But he still dies for them. He still dies for you and I. He's not someone who is afraid of the intimacy, afraid of the vulnerability of relationships. Jesus closes that gap and joins us and says, this is uncomfortable. There is sin that is separating us, but I'm going to remove that by any means necessary, which is his life and death on the cross for you and for I. And he fills in that gap that David couldn't for Absalom. He fills in that gap for you and I that we can't fill. No one can die for us and remove that piece. They can sacrifice for us, but they can't fill in the gap of which we've been separated because of sin. Only Jesus can do that. And if you are searching for a king like the people in 1 and 2 Samuel are, they do it in 1 and 2 Kings, chapter by chapter, book by book in the Bible. They're all searching for a king. They're all searching for someone to fill in that gap in their life, to make it right. You'll always be searching for a king until you find the one who can really do what you want them to do all along, which is Jesus. He has lived and died for you to save you. And he's not weeping because he wishes he could have. He already has. And so that is a promise that you and I can accept right now, here, today, that Jesus has died for you. He has done what others couldn't. And as an example, shows us how we can show up, how we can act, how we can be a part of uncomfortable situations, addressing the elephants in the room, showing up, loving, and not letting another moment go by to where we come to a point in our life where we would have to say, oh, what I wish I could have said, what I wish I could have done. I wish I would have told them I love them. I wish I would have had that conversation with them. Don't let another day go by in your life where you go closer to the moment where you would have to wish you could have done something. You wished you could have said something. God has died for you here now, today. Accept it and embrace it. Thank you.